Welcome everyone. Today we are going to walk through ISO 14001:2026, the international standard for environmental management systems. By the end of this session you will understand exactly what an EMS is, why organizations build one, and, critically, what evidence an auditor expects to see. We will go clause by clause, from clause 4 all the way to clause 10. We will keep things practical with real examples, so do not worry if you have never done this before. You will find that a lot of it is common sense, just written in a structured way. Let me give you a quick roadmap of where we are going today. The standard is structured around 10 clauses. Clauses 1 to 3 are definitions and scope, we are not covering those. We start at clause 4, which asks, who are you and where do you operate? Then clause 5 is about leadership. Clause 6 is planning, this is where you figure out your environmental risks. Clause 7 is support, people, resources, communication. Clause 8 is operation, doing the actual work. Clause 9 checks whether it is working. And clause 10 fixes what is not. Think of it as a complete management loop, we will see that more clearly on the next slide. Before we dive into the clauses, you need to understand the logic that holds the whole standard together. It is called PDCA, plan, do, check, act. Plan, you figure out what matters environmentally, your issues, risks, legal requirements, and objectives. That is clauses 4 to 7. Do you actually run the operations and controls you designed? That is clause 8. Check, you measure whether things are working, monitoring, audits, management reviews. Clause 9. Act, if something is not working, you fix it and improve. Clause 10. Then the cycle starts again. This is called continual improvement. Notice I said continual, not continuous. You do not have to be improving every single second. You just have to keep improving over time. The entire standard is built on this loop. Every requirement you will see today fits somewhere inside plan, do, check or act. We are now entering clause 4, context of the organization. This clause is all about self-awareness. Before you can manage your environmental impact, you need to understand who you are, where you operate, what pressures you face, and who cares about what you do. Think of clause 4 as laying the foundation of a building. Everything else in the EMS sits on top of it. If you get clause 4 wrong, if you misidentify your key issues or forget an important stakeholder, the rest of the system will be weak. There are 4 subclauses, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and 4.4. Let us work through each one. We are now entering clause 4, context of the organization. This clause is all about self-awareness. Before you can manage your environmental impact, you need to understand who you are, where you operate, what pressures you face, and who cares about what you do. Think of clause 4 as laying the foundation of a building. Everything else in the EMS sits on top of it. If you get clause 4 wrong, if you misidentify your key issues or forget an important stakeholder, the rest of the system will be weak. There are 4 subclauses, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and 4.4. Let us work through each one. Clause 4.2 asks, who cares about your environmental performance, and what do they want from you? An interested party is any person or group that can affect, or be affected by, your environmental decisions. That includes regulators, customers, local communities, investors, employees, NGOs, and even your neighbors. Your job is to, first, identify who they are. Second, find out what they need or expect. Third, and this is important, decide which of those needs become legal or other compliance obligations. Not every expectation becomes a hard rule. If a customer wants you to reduce your carbon footprint, that might be voluntary at first. But if a regulator says you must measure your emissions monthly, that is mandatory. The output of this clause is an interested party register and a link to your compliance obligations list, which we will cover in clause 6.1.3. Clause 4.3 asks, exactly where and what does your EMS cover? The scope is the documented statement that defines the boundaries of your EMS. It must be specific. You cannot just write, our EMS covers the whole company. You need to say, which sites, which activities, which products. You must consider your context from 4.1, your obligations from 4.2, and whether you have the authority and ability to control or influence the activities in question. For example, if you have 3 factories but only one is seeking certification, your scope needs to state clearly which factory and what activities within it are included. The scope must be documented and made available to interested parties who ask for it. A word of caution, you cannot cherry-pick your scope to exclude activities that are environmentally significant just because they are inconvenient. Auditors are trained to spot scope manipulation. Clause 4.4 is the most basic but most important of all. You must actually establish, implement, maintain and continually improve your EMS. This sounds obvious, but it is where many organizations fail. They write great procedures and registers but never actually use them in daily operations. The word maintain means, keep it alive and up to date. The word improve means, make it better over time, not just leave it static. You need to define the processes that make up your EMS, how they interact, and apply the learning from clauses 4.1 and 4.2 when designing those processes. The most common evidence is a process map, showing how your environmental processes link together, and an EMS manual. Although the manual is no longer required by the standard, it is still very common. We are now moving to clause 5, leadership. This clause is short, only 3 subclauses, but it is one of the most important in the whole standard. Why? Because an EMS without visible, committed leadership is just paperwork. ISO 14001:2026 uses the term top management, that means the CEO, MD, board, or whoever has ultimate authority in the organization. Not the EHS manager. Top management. Clause 5 has 3 parts. 5.1 is about commitment and accountability. 5.2 is about the environmental policy. 5.3 is about assigning clear roles and responsibilities. We are now moving to clause 5, leadership. This clause is short, only 3 subclauses, but it is one of the most important in the whole standard. Why? Because an EMS without visible, committed leadership is just paperwork. ISO 14001:2026 uses the term top management, that means the CEO, MD, board, or whoever has ultimate authority in the organization. Not the EHS manager. Top management. Clause 5 has 3 parts. 5.1 is about commitment and accountability. 5.2 is about the environmental policy. 5.3 is about assigning clear roles and responsibilities. Clause 6 is planning. This is where the EMS gets specific. What are your actual environmental issues? What laws do you have to follow? What could go wrong? And what are you going to achieve? There are 6 subclauses across clause 6, and they build on each other logically. First you understand your aspects and impacts, 6.1.2, then your legal obligations, 6.1.3, then your risks and opportunities, 6.1.4 and 6.1.5, and finally you set measurable objectives, 6.2. Clause 6.3 is new in ISO 14001:2026. It requires you to plan changes to the EMS in a controlled way. Planning is the heartbeat of your EMS. Get it right and everything else flows. Miss key aspects or legal requirements and you will have gaps that auditors and regulators will find. Clause 6.1.2 is one of the most critical requirements in the entire standard. You must identify what your organization does that interacts with the environment. An aspect is an element of what you do, for example, burning diesel in your generators. An impact is the environmental consequence, air pollution, contribution to climate change. You must look at your activities, products and services, and you must think about the full life cycle, not just what happens inside your gates. Think about how your raw materials are sourced upstream, and what happens to your products when they reach end of life downstream. Or you must also consider 3 conditions: normal operations, day-to-day running, abnormal conditions, start-up, shutdown, maintenance, and emergency conditions, fire, chemical spill, flood. From your full list, you identify the significant environmental aspects, the ones with the greatest potential environmental impact. These then drive your objectives, controls, and training. The significance criteria must be documented. Common approaches include scoring matrices, ranking likelihood and severity of impact. Whatever method you use must be consistent and defensible. Clause 6.1.3 requires you to know every law, permit, license, code and voluntary commitment that applies to your environmental aspects, and to keep that list current. Compliance obligations fall into 2 types: mandatory ones that you must comply with, laws, regulations, court orders, permits, and voluntary ones that you choose to comply with, industry codes of practice, contractual commitments, sustainability pledges. Both types are compliance obligations. Choosing to sign a voluntary code is no less binding than a regulation once you have committed to it. The legal register is your master list. Each entry should tell you what the law says, how it applies to you specifically, and what controls you have in place to meet it. The register must be reviewed regularly, annually at minimum, and immediately when laws change. If a regulator comes in and finds you are not aware of a law that affects you, that is a major non-conformance. Ignorance is not a defense in environmental compliance. Clause 6.1.4 and 6.1.5 bring in formal risk management, something that was lighter in earlier versions of ISO 14001. Based on everything you have learned about your context, 4.1, your stakeholders, 4.2, your aspects, 6.1.2, and your legal obligations, 6.1.3, you must now determine what risks threaten your EMS from achieving its goals, and what opportunities exist to improve. A risk is something that could prevent you from achieving your environmental objectives: a flood that destroys chemical storage, a staff shortage that compromises waste segregation, a supply chain disruption. An opportunity is something positive, a chance to switch to renewable energy, adopt cleaner technology, improve efficiency. Clause 6.1.5 requires you to plan how to address these risks and opportunities. That means, assign an action, give it an owner, set a deadline, and later check that the action worked. Notice this is very different from just listing risks on paper. The standard requires you to act on them. Clause 6.2 is where you set your environmental targets. Not vague aspirations, measurable, time-bound objectives with a clear action plan. Your objectives must be consistent with your environmental policy. If your policy says you are committed to reducing energy use, your objectives must include specific energy reduction targets. For each objective you must document what you are going to achieve. Who is responsible? What resources are needed? When you will achieve it? How you will measure progress, the KPI. Objectives must be monitored and reviewed. If you are falling behind on a target, that must come up in management reviews and trigger action. A common mistake is setting objectives that cannot be measured. For example, we will improve our environmental awareness. That is not measurable. Instead say, 100% of staff will complete EMS awareness training by June 2027. Clause 6.3 is new in ISO 14001:2026. It requires that whenever you make significant changes to a process, equipment, the scope, a product line, you manage that change in a planned, controlled way. Why does this matter for the EMS? Because uncontrolled changes often introduce new environmental aspects that nobody assessed. A new production line might generate a new chemical waste stream. A new supplier might use packaging materials you cannot recycle. The change management process should ask, what is the environmental impact of this change? Does it affect our aspect register? Our legal register? Our operating procedures? What training is needed? Changes can come from inside, new equipment, restructuring, or from outside, new laws, loss of a permit, climate-related events. The evidence is a change request form or change management procedure, with records showing the environmental impact was assessed before implementation. Clause 6.3 is new in ISO 14001:2026. It requires that whenever you make significant changes to a process, equipment, the scope, a product line, you manage that change in a planned, controlled way. Why does this matter for the EMS? Because uncontrolled changes often introduce new environmental aspects that nobody assessed. A new production line might generate a new chemical waste stream. A new supplier might use packaging materials you cannot recycle. The change management process should ask, what is the environmental impact of this change? Does it affect our aspect register? Our legal register? Our operating procedures? What training is needed? Changes can come from inside, new equipment, restructuring, or from outside, new laws, loss of a permit, climate-related events. The evidence is a change request form or change management procedure, with records showing the environmental impact was assessed before implementation. 7.1 Resources. You must determine what resources your EMS needs and provide them. This includes human resources, staff, time, financial resources, technology, and infrastructure. If you claim you have an EMS but have zero budget for it, that is a Clause 7.1 finding. 7.2 Competence. People doing work that can affect environmental performance must be competent to do it. Competence means the right education, training, or experience. And you must evaluate whether training is effective. Just attending a course is not enough if the person cannot actually do the task correctly afterwards. 7.3 Awareness. Even people who are not directly responsible for environmental tasks must be aware of your environmental policy, the significant environmental aspects relevant to their work, and what happens if they do not follow procedures. Awareness is about culture, not just training. A useful way to think about the difference: competence is for people who do environmental tasks. Awareness is for everyone else. 7.4 Communication. You must have a process for both internal and external environmental communication. For each type of communication you must define what is communicated, when, to whom, and how. Internal, monthly e-chase newsletters, toolbox talks, management review reports, training sessions. External, regulatory reports, responses to community complaints, annual sustainability reports, responses to customer questionnaires. 7.5, documented information, ISO 14001 requires specific records to exist. But it also lets you decide what additional documentation your organization needs. The standard no longer mandates a formal EMS manual, but many organizations keep one because it is useful. For all documented information you must control who can access it, how it is stored, how long it is retained, what the version control process is, and how you handle external documents like legal regulations. A practical tip: a document that nobody can find when the auditor asks for it is as bad as a document that does not exist. We are now in Clause 8, Operation. This is the do part of Plan Do Check Act. Clause 8 is where all of your planning turns into actual action on the ground. You take the significant aspects you identified in Clause 6, and you put in place the operational controls, procedures, and emergency plans to manage them. There are two sub-clauses. 8.1 is operational planning and control, your day-to-day controls. 8.2 is emergency preparedness and response, what you do when things go wrong. We are now in Clause 8, Operation. This is the do part of Plan Do Check Act. Clause 8 is where all of your planning turns into actual action on the ground. You take the significant aspects you identified in Clause 6, and you put in place the operational controls, procedures, and emergency plans to manage them. There are two sub-clauses. 8.1 is operational planning and control, your day-to-day controls. 8.2 is emergency preparedness and response, what you do when things go wrong. We are now in Clause 9, Performance Evaluation. This is the check part of PDCA. After all your planning and operations, Clause 9 asks the most important question: is it actually working? There are three parts. 9.1 is monitoring, measurement and compliance evaluation, your ongoing data collection. 9.2 is internal audit, your periodic system check. 9.3 is management review, top management's annual review of the whole EMS. Think of it as 3 levels of health check. 9.1 is daily vital signs, 9.2 is a quarterly medical examination, and 9.3 is an annual comprehensive review. 9.1.1, monitoring and measurement. You must decide what to monitor and measure, establish the method, set the frequency, and define how results will be analyzed and reported. Calibration matters here. If you are using instruments to measure emissions, wastewater discharge, or noise, those instruments must be calibrated and traceable. An uncalibrated instrument gives you data you cannot trust or defend. 9.1.2, compliance evaluation. This is separate from your daily monitoring. On a scheduled basis, typically semi-annually or annually, you evaluate whether you are actually meeting every compliance obligation in your legal register. The compliance evaluation is not the same as an audit. An audit checks whether your EMS conforms to the standard. A compliance evaluation specifically asks, are we following the law? If you find you are not complying, you raise a corrective action immediately. The status of your compliance must be known at all times. You cannot wait until the annual review to discover a breach that has been running for 6 months. Clause 9.2 requires you to conduct planned internal audits of your EMS at regular intervals. An internal audit has two purposes: verify that your EMS conforms to ISO 14001 requirements and verify that it is effectively implemented and maintained. Conformance means, do your documents and records meet the standard? Implementation means, are people actually following the procedures? You need an annual audit program, a schedule that covers all significant areas. Higher risk areas and areas with past findings should be audited more frequently. Auditors must be objective and impartial. This means you cannot audit your own work. A member of the HA's team auditing their own procedures is a conflict of interest. Findings from internal audits feed directly into Clause 10, corrective actions. Audits are not about catching people out. They are about finding weaknesses before external auditors, or regulators, find them first. Clause 9.3 is top management's annual check-in on the EMS. It must be a real meeting with real decisions, not a rubber stamp exercise. The inputs to the management review are prescribed by the standard. You must discuss changes in context or stakeholders, environmental performance data, audit results, compliance status, objective achievement, resource adequacy, stakeholder communications, and improvement opportunities. The outputs must include a conclusion on whether the EMS remains suitable, adequate, and effective. Decisions on resources. Actions when objectives have not been met. And direction on improvement. The evidence is signed meeting minutes with an action log. The minutes must show that all the required input topics were addressed. We are on the final clause, Clause 10. This is the act part of PDCA. Clause 10 closes the loop. Everything you have measured in Clause 9, monitoring data, audit findings, compliance evaluation results, management review actions, feeds into Clause 10 to drive improvement. There are two subclauses. 10.1 is continual improvement, ongoing enhancement of the EMS. 10.2 is nonconformity and corrective action, fixing specific failures and preventing them from recurring. 10.1, continual improvement, the EMS must continuously improve its suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. Improvement can come from anywhere: audit findings, monitoring data, management review decisions, employee suggestions, new technology. Improvement does not have to be dramatic. Small, consistent gains over time are exactly what continual improvement means. 10.2, nonconformity and corrective action. When something goes wrong, a compliance breach, an audit finding, an incident, you must follow a structured process, contain the problem, correct the immediate issue, investigate root cause, implement corrective action, verify that it works, and update the EMS if needed. The key step that many organizations skip is root cause analysis. If you just fix the symptom and not the cause, the same problem will come back. For example, if a chemical was spilled because the container was poorly labeled, fixing that label addresses the symptom. The root cause might be that nobody reviewed labeling compliance in the last 3 years. Corrective actions must be proportional. A minor administrative error does not need the same level of corrective action as a discharge breach that killed fish in a river. We are nearly at the end. Let us take a minute to consolidate what the standard actually requires you to document. This table is your checklist. These are the records that ISO 14001:2026 specifically mandates. If an auditor asks for any of these and you cannot produce them, even if the work was done, you have a finding. I always tell my clients, if it is not written down and filed, it did not happen. That is the auditor's operating principle. Take a photo of this slide. Laminate it and stick it on the wall in your office. Before we wrap up, let us quickly review the key terms you will see in the standard and in audit reports. Understanding these terms precisely matters because ISO 14001 uses them in very specific ways. Using the wrong term in an audit can cause confusion and suggest you do not understand the requirements. We have reached the end. Let me give you the 7 things I want you to remember from today. 1. Context. Clause 4. Know your environment before you plan your EMS. Your issues, stakeholders, and scope are the foundations everything else is built on. 2. Leadership. Clause 5. Management commitment must be visible and resourced. A policy poster and no budget is not leadership. 3. Planning. Clause 6. Your aspects lead to obligations, which lead to risks, which lead to objectives. It is one connected logical chain, not separate documents. 4. Support. Clause 7. Give people what they need: training, resources, information, and clear communication. 5. Operation. Clause 8. Plans become real through procedures, controls, and tested emergency responses. 6. Performance evaluation. Clause 9. If you are not measuring it, you do not know if it is working. 7. Improvement. Clause 10. Fix problems at the root cause, not just the symptom. Close the loop. Get better every year. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop a comment if you have questions. I'm happy to help explain more. And check out our other videos.